All right, hello everybody. Today I'm going to talk about a book I read for the first time this weekend. This is a pulp classic called The Mark of Zorro, or when it was serialized in All Story Weekly, it was called The Curse of Capistrano. The version I read was a scan of a book of the book The Mark of Zorro that came out in 1924, which included photos from the silent movie, or what they called then a photoplay, from 1920. The book was written by Johnston McCulley, and it was 5 parts in All Story Weekly back in 1919. Now, when I heard that this book was originally published as The Curse of Capistrano, my weird tales fan got the better of my subconscious, and I thought for a moment, oh, maybe there's some kind of weird stuff that happens in here that just doesn't, it's just not in any of the other Zorro stuff. And but no, I'm just stupid, right? Actually, the Curse of Capistrano is just a name that they have for Zorro because he's, a curse on all of their schemes and such. It is, in fact, the first appearance of the character Zorro, and that is the most famous of Johnston McCulley's characters. He wrote a bunch of different characters with a bunch of different pen names over time, and unfortunately, it seems like the information of which characters were written under which pen names has been, to a certain degree, lost to history, oddly enough. Because Because when I went to go check the Wikipedia for Johnston McCulley to see if there was anything I was, wanted to talk about, Wikipedia is a strange thing, right? Because I went on there and it says, it says at the top of the page for Johnston McCulley, oh, by the way, the page Frederick Phelps redirects here. If you want the founder of the Westboro Baptist Church, you need Fred Phelps. And I was like, well, that's an odd thing to put at the top of this page. There must be something about a pen name being Frederick Phelps, right? And actually, no, the Wikipedia article does not mention Frederick Phelps as one of his pen names. Other articles do, but that one does not. And, funnily enough, the Frederick Phelps that directs to Johnston McCulley is spelled wrong compared to the pen name that he actually used. McCulley actually used a Frederick with just ending with a C, Phelps, whereas the article that the thing that redirects to McCulley has Frederick with a K. And I just double checked, but Fred Phelps, the Westboro Baptist Church guy, is not named Frederick. His name is just Fred Phelps. So, total, very strange, but there it is. This story is fun. Everybody knows kind of what Zorro is at this point. He's become part of the culture, right? People know what Zorro is about because there's been so many copycats, and even Zorro itself was kind of a copycat. It has a lot of similarities to a story called The Scarlet Pimpernel by Baroness Orczy. I haven't read that, but maybe I will sometime. So this story takes place in Southern California in the early 19th century, more or less, when Mexico still ruled California. The tagline on one of the covers that I saw is, "When Romance and Rapiers Ruled Old California." So you kind of get an idea of what we're talking about here. Now, I'm going to do a spoiler section for this one. It's going to be kind of perfunctory because the book is over 100 years old, but I think it's no surprise to anyone that the point of Zorro is that the masked swordsman is actually his secret identity is the foppish, dandyish character who is the most unlike Zorro in the book, right? But when I read this, I kind of tried to keep this idea in my head of how much is the audience going to be aware of this? And, well, when I found out that there was a 1905 book called The Scarlet Pimpernel that did kind of the same thing with the secret identity, I figured, okay, well, maybe people kind of know what's going on. But speaking genuinely, it seems like McCulley is actually not trying to really let the cat out of the bag until about half the book is over. The main up until that point, the main evidence of who Zorro is that he doesn't cross this other character's path at all, and actually he has a tendency to appear right after this other character leaves. So, fair enough. That's a fairly strong indicator at some point, but at the same time, it seems like there's a little bit of effort to not completely be like, oh, it's this guy, right? It's not super obvious from the beginning of the book. there's also the fact that their personalities and voices are conspicuously opposite, right? Zorro has a deep voice, and Don Diego has a mild, timid voice, and stuff like that. When the actual like reveal happens is about halfway through the book, when a girl that Diego is wooing, her family goes to stay at Diego's house while he is gone. So they're there, and she looks through his library, and she finds a bunch of books on romance and fencing and horse riding, and she notices, she like notes, oh, it's so out of character for him to have all these books, ... And then later on, there's a point where Zorro suddenly has a mule whip, and just a few scenes earlier, we saw this other character with another character who had a mule. So, it's one of those things where, there is some direct evidence later on, and of course, it gets revealed at the very end of the book. But, I kind of feel like the audience probably knew what was going on. And so it was good to kind of look at it with that perspective and see, try to figure out, how obvious is it supposed to be? And to be fair, the fact that of every single character that is identified except one meets Zorro in the early part of the book, it's pretty obvious that these two must be the same character, because they're never in the room at the same time, right? But at the same time, it's not like a direct evidence thing until much later on. Actually, there's a few times where Diego kind of like goes off in one direction, and then Zorro comes in from the opposite direction, and so it kind of, it seems like he's trying to push a little bit of confusion. Then did he circle around and then switch to Zorro? Who knows? Now, this particular story begins with very little prologue, which was a little surprising to me. We have a soldier boasting in a tavern. The soldier's name is Pedro Gonzalez. He boasts about the kinds of things he'll do to Zorro if he finds him. And this character, Don Diego de la Vega, I believe, or Don Diego Vega, is the son of a very wealthy blue blood man, noble man in California. He himself is moderately rich because his father's given him a decent amount of land to kind of preside over, that kind of stuff. But he's there, and he kind of is laughing along with Gonzalez there. Diego leaves. Zorro appears immediately. He fights with Pedro Gonzalez. The interesting thing about Zorro is that in media, he seems to always, they focus a lot on his sword. But in the book, he almost always is equipped with both a sword and a pistol. And these are single-shot pistols from back in the day. And what Zorro tends to do is either use it to keep observers from interfering, or use it to prevent someone from doing something that he doesn't want them to do while he's fighting them, right? Oh, I don't want you to go and hurt this person while I'm fighting them, kind of thing. So, there you go. Now, of course, Zorro and Gonzalez fight. Zorro wins, of course, and he kind of runs off. And then Don Diego comes back to kind of poke fun at Gonzalez. This is actually an interesting part of the story, because a lot of the way that the characters, act and, like, how they... we're dealing with a time when dueling was a thing that people would do, right? And so we get a good taste of how of honor and how people perceive honor in the story, and also how far words can take you. Because Diego, says a few things that are kind of implied insults to Gonzalez, but Gonzalez also and basically the idea is that if anybody else had said that, Gonzalez would fight him or something like that. But Diego's offered a little bit more leeway because he's such a weak person. And before we get into the actual plot synopsis and stuff, I just want to say it is a fun story that is full of schemes and chases and sword fights. It's well written and doesn't feel dated even today. I didn't feel like, oh, this is, I didn't feel like there was a lot of it, like a really strong attempt to kind of, overextend the dated slang and stuff like that. It just works really well, really easy read. And honestly, the thing that I was not expecting from this book were some genuinely funny moments. So Don Diego's character is that he's this kind of weak, barely a man kind of gentleman character. And like him complaining about things is actually so funny because everybody around him is like, well, this is what you're supposed to do. He's like, oh, really? Every single it just but it doesn't get old either. You come to expect it, but the way that he does it is enough different every single time that that I always found it actually, like, genuinely chuckle-inducing kind of funny, which, is surprising for an adventure story from 100 years ago, a little bit, at least. Anyway, so, I mean, a spoiler section for the Zorro book is a little bit perfunctory, but I'll just make the note here and we'll switch over to the spoiler section. But, honestly, this story is not... It's not like it has a super simple plot either, but, it's the kind of the thing you expect. People get together, they fight, someone wins, Zorro runs off, they chase him, yada, 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 and, kind of repeat with a kind of overall plot tapestry in the background. But anyway, I'll switch here over to the spoiler section, and I'll tell you a little bit more about the story and what I thought. Okay, perfunctory spoiler section for a 100-year-old book. The first part of the plot, the book kind of separates into basically two halves. The first half is mainly about setting the stage for the second half. We have Don Diego Vega as the useless, kind of dandy-ish character. And he's not really even a dandy, because a dandy has, like, positive characteristics of being perhaps, good at flowery words, or, he at least, is dashing in a sense, or something like that. Don Diego is not even really that. He's really just kind of useless, and like, conspicuously so. The backdrop of this story is that in this part of California, we have all these corrupt and lying officials, and they're treating the Franciscan monks and the natives very unfairly. And so Zorro is kind of around and kind of robbing from the rich to punish them for the bad things that they've done to the poor or the natives or the monks. And Zorro kind of runs kind of a, what would you call it, like a guerrilla campaign on people. He finds out that someone has committed some kind of bad deed. He appears, he, fences with them, hits them. It's suggested early in the story that he carves a Z in people. And this is an interesting point, because in, like, the stories and stuff, right, he always does the thing with, like, the big flamboyant Z on the shirt or something like that, and cutting through the cloth, which does a couple of things, right? It prevents you from having any actual, like, visible bloodshed for a television show or a movie, which helps with ratings and things like that. But it also is larger and more visible, right? In this story, we get an early on suggestion that he does carve the Z into people's bodies, but it only actually happens once in the book, and at the very end, which I'll get to in a few minutes. And I found that to be kind of interesting, because, right, like, when you serialize, not serialize, but when you, like, I guess serialize might be the right word, right? When you serialize this story into, like, a radio show or a television show, every single episode ends with someone getting the Z carved in them, or maybe it's at the beginning for a change of pace, but, it's the kind of thing you expect to see commonly. But it actually only happens once in this book, and it's a decently long book. The copy that I had was about 300 pages, with some fairly large text, but still decent. It took me a few hours to read through it. Now, here's the main idea of the plot. Don Diego's father, Don Alejandro, he owns this huge ranch, right? And he's basically telling, hey, Diego, Don Diego, go find a wife, or else I will give all of my land to the Franciscan monks and not you when I die. And so Don Diego basically goes over to the Pulido estate, and he asks to woo Don Carlos's daughter, Lolita. Now, this is another part where it's genuinely funny, because, Don Carlos is like, okay, well, you need to woo my daughter, you need to try to, make her be interested in you, you need to sweep her off your feet, and he does all this. He's like so put upon by the suggestion that he might actually have to put any effort into this. He's like, well, I actually have a guy at my estate who's really good at playing guitar, so maybe I'll have him come by tonight and serenade her. And Don Carlos is like, no, don't do that. That's a really bad idea, right? And it's not like he's even subtle about it. He's like, oh, this seems like it will be such a bother, but I guess I'll try it anyway. And then he doesn't even bother to try it for the most part. As you might expect, this does not go well, right? She is not particularly enamored by him, and there's kind of this element where, well, he's like the richest guy in the area, and his dad is even richer, and so you and your family will both be set for for life if you marry him. And so she actually does feel a little bit of pressure both ways, right? But in the end, she's like, well, let me think about it, kind of thing, right? It's, I don't know, it's just genuinely like I didn't expect there to be good comedy in this book, and it's there in spades, and like I was just really surprised by how funny. Because this kind of thing could get old, or it could get really cliche, or it could be poorly written, but it's actually really well done and well timed, and they don't throw it all at you at once. They give you a little trickle, and then someone suggests something, and you're like, oh my goodness, and then, Don Diego does something ridiculous, and it's really quite good. Now, Don Diego leaves, and he's like, well, think about it for a couple of days and let me know, and I'm going to head back home. And, he's acting so put out that he had to ride on a horse for 4 miles there, and then 4 miles back. He's like, this might kill me. And it's like, dude, I can walk 4 miles, right? So, that happens, and then it's the siesta time, so everybody's taking a break, and suddenly Zorro appears, and he bothers Lolita. And of course, this is Don Diego, but nobody else knows that. But of course, he's much more dashing, and he, has the what would you call it? Like the the characteristics of a daring and dashing gentleman, that worthy of a good lady kind of thing. And so she's kind of interested in Zorro, but actually, there's not actually like a sudden, like, immediate snap over into like, oh, she really likes Zorro. I mean, she kind of does. She's like, oh, I wish Don Diego could be more like Zorro. But that estate is, not a bad, encouragement for me and my family, because her family has also been like censured by the governor for being not particularly obedient or something like that. So Zorro leaves, but then night falls and Zorro comes back. He's like, hey, I'm a traveling, gentleman, and I'd like some hospitality. And this is an interesting thing too, because it is the culturally speaking, it is interesting because Don Carlos sees it as his duty to feed this person who is a known bandit. And of course, this could be very bad for him unless he does something about it. And so what he does is he goes off stealthily to try to get some of the soldiers to come and help and capture Zorro. He's like, I got to do something so that it doesn't look like I'm in cahoots with him. But of course, it ends up looking like he's more in cahoots because the soldiers surround the house, and Zorro looks like he's escaped. But then the antagonist of the story, Captain Ramon, appears, and he also becomes enamored with Lolita. But she kind of sees through him. She sees that he's not a particularly nice person or something like that, and she's not interested, right? But then it turns out that Zorro actually didn't run away. So he jumps out, he fights Ramon, and he wounds him in the shoulder. It's actually kind of a neat scene because they're fighting, and Ramon says, Zorro says, something along the lines of like, which shoulder do you want me to impale you through? And Ramon is like, Captain Ramon is like, oh, my right shoulder. And so now he knows that he's just got to protect his right shoulder. But Zorro manages to overpower him in the fencing and, thrust the sword through his shoulder, and then he runs off. Now, this actually triggers the second half of the story, and from a literary perspective, there's actually something interesting going on here, because what happened earlier? Remember that I said earlier that Pedro Gonzalez fought Zorro? Well, one of the things that Pedro Gonzalez did is he lied about what happened with Zorro. He said, oh yeah, Zorro was threatening me with the gun so that I couldn't actually fight him well, right? So he's doing a dishonorable thing in order to kind of partly save his skin. In fact, at the beginning of the story, Zorro only used the pistol to prevent any of his other soldiers from coming to his aid while they fought, and Zorro actually was a very good fencer and overpowered him, in an honorable way. But now we have someone even worse in the same situation. Captain Ramon has been impaled through the right shoulder by Zorro. Is that my right shoulder? Yeah, that's my right shoulder. Has been impaled through the right shoulder by Zorro. And now he comes up with the idea of using this to suggest to the governor that not only, did Zorro do some underhanded stuff to cut him through the shoulder, but also that Don Carlos Pulido was actually in cahoots with Zorro. So he's basically doing the same thing Gonzalez was doing, but on a greater scale. He's going to come up with a series of lies that are going to make it so that he can hopefully catch Zorro and also punish Don Carlos Pulido and his family. So because Zorro basically attacked Don Carlos's house, Don Diego says, "Oh, well, I'm leaving for my hacienda, and so if you want, I have, my house in the pueblo where you can stay while I'm gone, and you can bring your whole family, and you'll be closer to the troops, and so you'll be safer from Zorro or anything like that. And it'll look good too because it'll show that I'm being generous to my hopefully future family." So they go there, and I forget what exactly happens, but I think somebody like one of the commanders in the area basically asks Don Carlos and his wife to come visit them and have dinner with them, and they leave Lolita there in Don Diego's house. Now, what ends up happening is that Ramon comes over to Don Diego's house, and he starts bothering her. And so what basically happens is that, Zorro comes out of nowhere, and not only does he kind of humiliate Captain Ramon, he also forces Captain Ramon to get onto his knees and apologize to her, as well as kind of promise to never bother her again, kind of thing. So this is building now, right? Now Ramon has found Zorro twice when he was trying to woo this particular woman, and he's seeing this as more and more of like a conspiracy, or at least he's pretending that it's more and more of a conspiracy by the Pulido family to aid Zorro, which is good for him because it means that he can blackmail, basically, and get himself a wife. In addition, we also see another lying official in the area, right? What happens is that there's a friend of Zorro or of Don Diego whose name is Brother Felipe, right? And Brother Felipe sells some furs or I guess hides to someone, and then the people who he sold the hides to conspire to burn the hides, say that the hides were rotten, and then try to basically extract the money out from Brother Felipe again. So we get to see a trial, and of course we have some perjured witnesses and a bunch of lying going on, and Zorro finds out about this, and so he decides to kind of avenge Brother Felipe. He basically pulls all of the bad actors in this situation. He basically has them all whipped, just like they whipped Felipe. But the problem with this is that up to this point, Zorro's been a thorn in the sides of the authorities, but not really a huge one. But now he's really pissed off some important people. So now Zorro not only has to deal with a larger enemy force, but he also has more work to do, and the forces are organizing more effectively against him. I'm not going to go into the whole details of the second half of the story, but suffice it to say that, a bunch of crazy stuff happens, including the governor shows up. Captain Ramon tells him the lies about the Pulido family. The Pulido family gets jailed. Zorro has to break them out of jail. Zorro gathers a bunch of the other gentlemen in the area and kind of... Zorro's a very interesting character in the sense that he's very, idealistically good, right? He's all about justice and fairness and being, kind of nice to people, basically, because the Franciscan monks and the natives don't get treated very well by the Mexican government. So he gathers a bunch of the gentlemen to his side, and there's some adventures with them as well. But basically the idea is he saves the Pulidos, he outmaneuvers the governor and his troops, and wins the girl's heart. There's only one Z drawn in this book on a person, and that is a Z drawn on Captain Ramon's forehead right before Zorro runs him through. So, not a particularly visible Z, I guess, because he's not going to be walking around with it. But anyway, the thing about this story is that it ends very like authoritatively. He removes his mask in front of everyone. He's going to settle down and get married, and everybody knows that he was Zorro now. And it's and everybody's like, hip hip hooray! Zorro was the good guy all along because he won. But like, in no way does this book pretend that there's going to be a sequel later on. In fact, it turns out, based on what I was able to read, is that more Zorro stories were only forthcoming in like 1922 or so, which is 2 years after this photo play came out, and people were clamoring Macaulay for more of the stories. So, yeah, that's the spoiler section. So let's move on to the conclusion. All right, in conclusion, this is a genuinely fun and funny story, even today. I found it humorous, and like, it has a good plot that's not too complicated, but it has some twists and turns that are, I think, interesting, even as I was reading them. I mean, we all know this kind of story. It's kind of become cliche. We've seen the masked swordsman with a secret identity, or the masked warrior of some sort with a secret identity for a long time, and it's kind of become an important part of popular culture. But this was one of the first, and for that reason, it's worth looking at, just to see where things were back in the beginning. It's fun because at the very end of the story, there's actually a fairly diplomatic solution that goes on. It's not that Zorro kills all the bad guys and, is the last one left standing. It's more complicated than that, and for that reason, I think it's a little bit more interesting. And I said this in the spoiler section, but, this is a weird book because even though it spawned a huge number of subsequent stories, it doesn't tease a sequel. So I think that's also something worth, like, paying attention to when you're reading this book, is that there's no suggestion that there's going to be another Zorro story, but popularity is a hell of a drug. So anyway, that's what I've got for you today, for The Mask of Zorro, aka The Curse of Capistrano. I hope you enjoyed this. I will put links in the description to go check out a copy of this book for free if you want. And have a good week, and I will see you next time.